The bitter winter wind whipped through downtown Chicago as a young girl huddled deeper into her worn jacket. At just 19, she had already learned more about survival than most people learn in a lifetime. Her dark curly hair peeked out from beneath a faded blue beanie as she walked through the busy streets, invisible to the rushing crowds around her. Life hadn't always been this way for her. 2 years ago, she had a foster home, a warm bed, and dreams of becoming a nurse. But when she turned 18, the system let her go, and with no family to turn to, she found herself on these unforgiving streets. Despite her circumstances, she never lost her kindness. Every morning, she would share her blanket with elderly Miss Chen, who slept in the alley behind the Chinese restaurant. During the day, she'd help other homeless folks find the best soup kitchens or safest places to rest. The local shelter volunteers knew her as the girl who always saved half her bread for someone who might need it more. Home was now an abandoned building she shared with 5 other young people who'd aged out of the system. They looked out for each other, pooling their resources and sharing whatever food they could find. At night, they would gather around candles, sharing stories and dreams, trying to keep their hopes alive in the darkness. That morning, she had managed to get a spot in the breakfast line at Hope Community Center. The smell of hot coffee and pancakes made her stomach growl, but she knew to eat slowly, making each bite last. You never knew when your next meal would come on the streets. As she ate, she watched people walking past the center's windows. Business people with steaming coffee cups, students with heavy backpacks, tourists taking pictures, all living lives that felt like a distant dream to her. But she didn't let bitterness take root. Instead, she focused on her plan: save enough money from odd jobs to get her ID and documents in order, then apply for proper work. The shelter coordinator had started letting her help sort donated clothes and toiletries. It wasn't paid work, but it gave her purpose and kept her warm during the cold mornings. Plus, she got first pick of the donated items, which meant she could help others who needed specific things. The afternoon found her collecting discarded cans and bottles. Every nickel counted toward her dream. She had a special box hidden in the building where she kept her savings, wrapped carefully in an old sock. $23.40 so far, not much, but it was a start. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows between the skyscrapers, she headed toward her usual spot near Pete's Grocery. The owner sometimes gave away day-old bread at closing time. Other homeless folks knew her there too. She always made sure everyone got a fair share when there were handouts. Her stomach growled again, but she smiled, remembering she had saved half a sandwich from lunch. It was wrapped carefully in her pocket, saved for later when the hunger would be harder to ignore. People often asked why she shared when she had so little herself. The answer was simple: helping others made her feel human in a world that often treated her as invisible. Little did she know, as she walked past the gleaming store windows and hurrying crowds, that tomorrow would bring a chance encounter that would change everything. But for now, she pulled her jacket tighter and kept walking, holding on to hope like a candle in the wind. Life was hard, but she refused to let it harden her heart. Each person she helped, each smile she shared, was a small victory against the circumstances that had brought her here. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be the day things would start to change. Morning arrived with a biting chill that cut through her thin jacket. The young girl had just finished helping at the shelter's breakfast service when she noticed an elderly man struggling with his grocery bags outside Pete's store. His hands trembled as he tried to manage 3 heavy bags, his cane awkwardly tucked under one arm. The girl watched as people rushed past him, everyone too busy with their own lives to notice his struggle. Some even bumped into his bags, making him stumble slightly. Her own stomach growled. She hadn't eaten yet, saving her breakfast portion for later. But something in the old man's eyes reminded her of her grandfather, a distant memory from before the foster homes. Without hesitation, she walked over to him. "Sir, would you like some help with those bags?" she asked softly, keeping a respectful distance. The old man looked up, startled. His weathered face showed initial suspicion, something she was used to seeing. People often judged her by her worn clothes and tired appearance. "I don't have any money to give you," he said cautiously, clutching his bags closer. His voice was gentle despite the wariness in his eyes. She noticed his hands shaking more as he tried to adjust his grip. "I'm not asking for money, sir," she smiled warmly. "Those bags look heavy, and I'm heading this way anyway." She pointed in the general direction he was facing, though she had no particular destination in mind. The old man studied her face for a moment. Perhaps he saw something trustworthy in her eyes, or maybe it was just the weight of the bags becoming too much. "Well," he said slowly, "if you're sure it's no trouble." She carefully took 2 of the heaviest bags, leaving him with the lightest one and a better grip on his cane. As they walked, she matched his slow pace, making sure not to get too far ahead. The old man's breathing was labored, and she noticed him leaning heavily on his cane. "My apartment's just 3 blocks away," he explained between breaths. "My daughter usually helps with the shopping, but she's home with a sick child today." He paused to rest at a corner, and she waited patiently. "I'm not as young as I used to be," he added with a small chuckle. As they walked, she noticed him glancing at her occasionally, probably wondering about her story. But he didn't ask, and she didn't tell. Instead, they talked about simple things: the weather, the busy streets, the fresh bread he bought from the bakery. When they reached the 2nd block, the old man stumbled slightly on an uneven piece of sidewalk. Without dropping the bags, she managed to steady him with her elbow. "Careful, sir," she said gently. "These sidewalks can be tricky." "You're very kind," he said, looking at her with new eyes. Not many young people would take the time to help an old man these days. There was something in his voice, not pity, but a kind of wondering sadness. "My grandfather always said that kindness doesn't cost anything," she replied, the words coming out before she could stop them. It was one of the few memories she had of him, sitting in his old armchair, sharing wisdom she'd never forgotten. The old man smiled, a genuine warm smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," he said softly. They continued walking, now in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Neither of them knew it yet, but this simple act of kindness was about to set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures, like helping an old man with his groceries on a cold morning in Chicago. They were almost at his apartment building when the old man's legs suddenly gave way. She reacted quickly, dropping the grocery bags to catch him before he fell. As she helped him to a nearby bench, she noticed how pale he looked, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Should I call someone?" She reached for the old flip phone she kept for emergencies, one of her few possessions from better days, though it could only make emergency calls now. The old man waved off her concern, but his hands were shaking more than before. "Just need to catch my breath," he said weakly. I haven't eaten since yesterday. My blood sugar gets low sometimes." He tried to smile, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Without hesitation, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the sandwich she'd saved from the shelter, her only meal for the day. "Please," she said, unwrapping it carefully. "You need to eat something." The sandwich was simple, just peanut butter and jelly, but it was fresh and would help with his blood sugar. The old man started to refuse, but she gently insisted. "I can get another one," she lied, breaking the sandwich in half. "At least take half." She remembered how her mother, before everything changed, used to tell her that sharing food was like sharing love. He accepted the half sandwich gratefully, and they sat together on the cold bench. As he ate slowly, color began returning to his face. She pretended not to notice how his eyes welled up with tears at her kindness. "You know," he said after a while, his voice stronger now, "I used to be a doctor at the county hospital. 40 years of taking care of others, and now I can barely take care of myself." He looked down at his hands, weathered by time and work. Getting old isn't for the faint of heart. She listened quietly, recognizing the need in his voice to be heard. How many times had she wished for someone to just listen to her? "Being human isn't always easy," she said softly, "no matter how old we are." A chilly breeze rustled through the nearly bare trees above them, sending a few stubborn leaves dancing around their feet. The old man watched them swirl and said, "My wife used to pack me a sandwich every day for lunch at the hospital. Peanut butter and jelly was her specialty." His voice grew distant with memory. "She passed away last spring." The girl felt a familiar ache in her chest, the kind that comes from recognizing someone else's loneliness. She picked up one of the fallen leaves, its edges turned golden by autumn. "Sometimes the simplest things mean the most," she said, thinking of her own lost family. They sat there for a few more minutes, sharing a comfortable silence that felt like a warm blanket against the cold world around them. Finally, the old man felt strong enough to stand. She gathered the grocery bags again, and they walked the remaining distance to his building. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment of shared vulnerability, a sandwich split between strangers on a cold bench, would become the foundation of something extraordinary. Sometimes the deepest connections are formed not through grand gestures, but through simple acts of human kindness when we need them most. As they approached his building, the old man seemed lost in thought. What she didn't know was that he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Not just as a kind stranger, but as someone who had given her last meal to help another human being in need. Someone who, despite having so little, was rich in the things that truly mattered. Inside his small but tidy apartment, the old man insisted she stay for a cup of hot tea. The warmth of the apartment made her realize just how cold she'd been outside. As she helped him put away the groceries, he noticed her careful, organized approach, the way she arranged items so the oldest would be used first, how she handled each item as if it were precious. "You seem to know your way around a kitchen," he observed, watching her methodically sort through the bags. The steam from their teacups curled up in the quiet apartment. She paused, her hands hovering over a can of soup. "I used to help in the group home kitchen," she said softly, then added, "before I aged out." The words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them. The old man's expression changed, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The foster system?" he asked gently, stirring his tea. When she nodded, he pulled out a chair at his small kitchen table. "Please, sit with me for a moment." She hesitated, then sat down, wrapping her cold hands around the warm teacup. The china was delicate, with tiny blue flowers painted around the rim. It reminded her of a set her first foster mother had kept in a glass cabinet, never to be used. "You know," the old man said, "I've seen many young people come through the hospital over the years. Some of the hardest cases were kids aging out of the system." He took a careful sip of his tea. "How long have you been on your own?" The question was asked with such genuine care that she found herself answering honestly. "A year and 8 months," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had plans to start nursing school, but—" She trailed off, looking down at her worn shoes. "But you needed documents, money, a permanent address," he finished for her. She nodded, surprised at how well he understood. "The system makes it hard to get started, doesn't it?" "I try," she said, her voice stronger now. "I help at the shelter when I can. They let me sort donations, and sometimes I can use their address for mail. I've saved some money, but getting an ID is—" She gestured helplessly. The old man listened intently as she explained the catch-22 of her situation, needing an address to get ID, needing ID to get a job, needing a job to get an address. She told him about the group of young people she stayed with, how they looked out for each other, shared what little they had. "And still, you stopped to help an old man with his groceries," he said thoughtfully, "even shared your only meal of the day." There was something in his voice she couldn't quite read. She shrugged, embarrassed by his focus on her kindness. "Everyone needs help sometimes," she said simply. "Besides, you reminded me of someone I used to know." The old man stood up slowly and walked to a shelf filled with photographs. He picked up one showing a group of young nurses outside a hospital. 30 years ago, I helped start a program at the hospital for underprivileged students who wanted to become nurses," he said, his voice distant with memory. "Some of our best nurses came from backgrounds similar to yours." She found herself drawn to the photograph, to the proud faces of the young nurses. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine standing among them, wearing a crisp white uniform, helping others in a real way. The afternoon light was fading outside his windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. She knew she should go. Her friends would be worried, and the streets weren't safe after dark. But something about this moment, this conversation, felt important in a way she couldn't explain. As the young girl prepared to leave, the old man shuffled to his worn leather wallet sitting on the counter. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Please," he said, pulling out some bills, "take this for your help today." She immediately shook her head, taking a step back. "No, sir. I didn't help you for money." Her voice was firm but gentle. "Knowing you're okay is enough." She glanced at the kitchen clock. It was getting late, and she needed to check on Miss Chen before dark. The old man watched her, his eyes bright with something that looked like tears. "You know," he said quietly, "in all my years at the hospital, I learned that the ones with the least to give often have the biggest hearts." He slowly tucked the money back into his wallet, respecting her wishes. She smiled, adjusting her worn beanie. "Sometimes giving is all we have," she replied, thinking of the makeshift family she'd found on the streets, how they shared everything despite having nothing. Before she left, the old man asked for her name and where he might find her again. She hesitated, then told him about the shelter where she helped sort donations. "I'm there most mornings," she said, not expecting him to remember or care. What she didn't know was that as soon as she left, the old man would pick up his phone and make an important call. She didn't know that he wasn't just any retired doctor, but Dr. Wilson, the former chief administrator of County General Hospital, who still held considerable influence in the medical community. As she walked down the hallway, she heard him call out one last time. "Wait!" She turned to see him standing in his doorway, leaning on his cane. "Thank you," he said simply, but his voice carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "You've given me more than just help with groceries today. You've given me hope." She felt her throat tighten with emotion, but managed to smile. "Take care of yourself, sir. And don't skip meals anymore, okay?" The old man nodded, and she turned away quickly before he could see the tears in her eyes. Walking down the streets as evening approached, she thought about their conversation. For a brief moment, she'd felt normal again, just a person having tea with another person, sharing stories and dreams. Not a homeless girl, not someone to avoid or pity, just human. The city was changing around her as day shifted to night. Office workers hurried home, restaurants began their dinner service, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. She picked up her pace, knowing she needed to get back to her usual spot. What she didn't see was the old man watching from his window as she disappeared around the corner. She didn't see him pick up the phone again, this time calling his daughter. She didn't hear him say, "I think I found someone special. Someone who reminds me of why we started that nursing program all those years ago." As she walked, she allowed herself a small moment of pride. Not for helping, that was just what decent people did, but for maintaining her dignity, for refusing the money. Sometimes, she thought, it was important to show people that kindness wasn't a transaction, that even someone with nothing could give something valuable. The evening air grew colder, and she pulled her jacket tighter. Tomorrow would be another day of survival, another day of trying to piece together a future from the scattered fragments of her dreams. But somehow, today's encounter had left her feeling different, as if she'd been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long while. The next morning dawned bright and cold. The old doctor and his daughter walked through downtown Chicago, their breath visible in the crisp air. The daughter, a kind-faced woman in her 30s, listened intently as her father described the young girl who had helped him yesterday. "You should have seen her," he said, his eyes bright with purpose. "She gave me her only meal of the day without hesitation, and when I offered her money, she refused." He paused to catch his breath, leaning on his cane. "She's exactly the kind of person we've been looking for." They started their search at Pete's Grocery, where the encounter had begun. The store owner remembered seeing her occasionally, but couldn't say where she might be found. "She's one of the good ones," he said, adjusting his apron. "Sometimes helps other homeless folks divide up the day-old bread I give out." The morning stretched on as they visited various shelters and soup kitchens. At each stop, people knew who they were talking about, even without a name. "Oh, the girl with the kind eyes?" one shelter volunteer said. "She helps sort donations here." Another added, "She was here early this morning, but she left to check on some of the elderly homeless folks." The doctor's daughter watched her father's determination grow with each conversation. She hadn't seen him this energized since her mother passed away. Every person they spoke to had a story about the girl's kindness, how she shared information about free clinics, helped others fill out forms, or simply sat and listened to those who needed someone to talk to. By afternoon, they had covered much of downtown. The doctor was tired but refused to give up. "She's out there somewhere," he insisted, his voice firm despite his fatigue. "And she deserves a chance." They stopped at a small park where homeless people often gathered. A group of young people eyed them suspiciously until the doctor explained who they were looking for. "Oh, you mean our guardian angel," one young man said, his face softening. "She helped me get my birth certificate last month. used her shelter male privileges. Just then, the doctor's daughter spotted someone matching the description across the street. They watched as a young girl in a blue beanie helped an elderly Asian woman with a cart full of recyclables. Even from a distance, they could see the gentle care she took, making sure the cart didn't tip over on the uneven sidewalk. "That's her," the doctor whispered, his voice catching with emotion. They watched as she laughed at something the elderly woman said, her whole face lighting up despite her obvious exhaustion. The daughter saw what her father meant now. There was something special about the way the girl carried herself, a dignity that transcended her circumstances. She helped without making others feel less, gave without expecting anything in return. As they crossed the street, the doctor's daughter thought about the nursing program her father had started years ago. She remembered the stories of lives transformed, of people who just needed one person to believe in them. Looking at her father's face, she knew he saw the same potential in this young girl. The elderly woman with the cart noticed them first and said something to the girl. As she turned to face them, recognition flickered across her features. For a moment, she looked like she might run. A habit born from too many disappointments. But then she saw the genuine warmth in the old doctor's smile, and something made her stay. The old doctor stood before her, looking more energetic than he had yesterday. Beside him was a warm-faced woman who shared his kind eyes, his daughter, she guessed. The elderly woman with the cart squeezed her hand and shuffled away, leaving them to talk. "I've been looking for you all morning," the doctor said, his voice filled with purpose. "I need to tell you something important." He gestured to a nearby bench, and they all sat down. The doctor's daughter opened her bag and pulled out a folder. "Dad told me about your kindness yesterday," she said softly. "But what really touched us was learning about your dream to become a nurse." The young girl's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone to remember that part of their conversation, let alone act on it. She looked down at her worn shoes, suddenly conscious of how she must appear to these well-dressed people. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday," the doctor continued. "I'm Dr. Wilson, former chief administrator at County General Hospital. 30 years ago, I started a program for promising students who needed a second chance." He paused, making sure she was following. "Students like you." His daughter opened the folder, revealing official-looking papers. "We want to help you," she explained. "Not just with school, but with everything you need to get there. A room in Dad's house, help getting your documentation in order, and a full scholarship to nursing school." The girl sat very still, afraid to believe what she was hearing. She'd learned long ago that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The old doctor leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Because yesterday you showed me something rare. In a world where most people walk past suffering, you stopped to help. When you had only one meal, you shared it. That's exactly the kind of person we need in healthcare." "But I have nothing," she protested weakly. "No ID, no address, no proper clothes." "We'll help with all of that," the daughter assured her. "Dad's already called his contacts at the hospital's legal department. They'll help expedite your documentation." She smiled warmly. "You're not alone anymore." Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as reality slowly sank in. She thought about the other homeless youths she looked after, about Miss Chen and her cart of recyclables. "My friends here," she started. "You can still help them," Dr. Wilson said gently. "In fact, once you're a nurse, you'll be able to help even more people. That's what this program is all about, creating ripples of positive change." The sun broke through the clouds, warming their faces. Around them, the city continued its busy pace, but on this bench, time seemed to stand still. The girl looked at the folder in her lap, at the papers that represented everything she dreamed of. "I won't let you down," she said finally, her voice stronger now. "I promise." The doctor's daughter wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We know you won't. Welcome to the family." As they helped her gather her few belongings from the abandoned building, the girl thought about how life could change in an instant. Yesterday, she'd simply helped an old man with his groceries. Today, she was taking the first step toward a new life. And years later, when she would walk the hospital halls in her nurse's uniform, she would always remember to look for the helpers, the dreamers, the ones who needed just one person to believe in them. Because sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come full circle, creating endless ripples of hope in a world that desperately needs it.